I'm Tkacs. Welcome back to my channel. Let's get into talking about motorcycle handlebar risers. If you're a tall rider and you think you need risers and that's the first thing you do to a motorcycle, you may be doing exactly the wrong thing. And if you're a short rider and you've never considered using motorcycle handlebar risers, that may be an error as well. I've spent almost 30 years training riders, and what I have discovered is if the motorcycle is not set up properly, if the ergonomics are all messed up, it's an uphill battle. It adds to your fatigue, it makes things more dangerous, and it definitely takes away from the fun. So all these numbers here behind me are the takeaways from my day-to-day, where all I've done is spent adjusting handlebars, swapping handlebars, putting risers on and taking risers off to figure out what's the pattern, when you should use them, and when you shouldn't use them. Let me show you how I did that. Taking measurements is more like doing suspension than measuring actual distances. What I was looking for was the relative change when I add or delete risers or when I adjust handlebars up or down. To do this, what I did is take a piece of angle iron that I can put on the bottom edge of the handlebars. That way I'm always measuring at the same spot. For each of the measurements that are on the board that I used over there, what I did is I took a tape measure, I put the bars or the piece of angle on the backside edge of the bar, and I measured to the top of the ignition all the way back to the flat edge of the bar. The next thing I did was I measured from the fuel tank up to the bottom. What I was doing was I started off with a factory setup handlebars with the zero tilt position, which is what BMW does. Then every measurement after that went for handlebar rotation or to add or delete different risers. It turns out that 10 degrees is just about ideal. What I don't like to do is over-rotate handlebars. What I mean by over-rotating is a lot of riders will loosen up the clamp and they'll rotate the handlebars so far forward that the ends of the bars end up sticking up and they end up making a V formation. It's a very common thing I see on GS riders, but I also see it on other motorcycles as well. The reason it's so noticeable for the guys that ride the GSs is because these particular bikes have a lot of rise and sweep, which really showed up on the numbers I'm going to go through here in a little bit. So definitely, we're never going to want to over-rotate those bars. If the ends of the bars are sticking up in the air instead of being flat, that's when we have to do something different. When I mention a block riser, this is what I'm talking about here. This is just a chunk of aluminum that goes between the factory clamp and the bottom of the handlebar, and it's just a spacer. It holds the handlebar up higher in the air. The other type of riser is what I call a rotating riser, and the most common brand is a ROX. And this is what a ROX riser looks like. The ROX riser allows the riser here to go into the clamp and then raise up to the handlebar, but this one can be rotated forward or back, allowing me to change the distance and also the height of the handlebar. Some other important aspects about handlebars besides the risers are the handlebars themselves. Now, a standard adventure bike has a certain sweep or pullback, and that's 19 degrees. Almost all of the manufacturers run a 19 degrees sweep or pullback on the bars. These are the BMW bars, the factory bars that came off of the GS Rally here. These are replaced with a 15 degree bar that are the flex bars. This is the KTM. These are factory bars from a KTM 790. These are also 19 degrees. What they do have is a different rise. So I did end up putting these on the BMW just to see how that would make a difference. So I compared the factory bars. That's my primary focus because I'm looking at motorcycle risers primarily during this video, but I also want to see how the different handlebars themselves would make a difference as well. Again, focusing a lot on how can I get a bike set up perfectly for those riders who are really tall, because the reality is we need longer motorcycles for those really tall riders. That's not really an option. Turns out handlebars may just be that solution. Now let's get back to the numbers. What did all of these adjustments and changes do? I started off by taking the OEM bars at a 0, and then I rotated it 10%. Like I mentioned, I want to have those handlebars level all the way across. It turns out that 10 degrees works on the BMWs. It's also the same on the Africa Twin. It's also the same on most of your KTMs. And when you end up doing that, the net gain is what really matters. That 10% rotation on this particular motorcycle gained me an extra 1/4 inch of space in front of me and raised the handlebar 1.5 inches. That's just rotating forward. It's a huge gain and a huge benefit because I'm creating space in front of me. And that's important if you're a tall rider. If I add the riser, the block riser, I do end up with more rise. So instead of coming off of, as an example, when I took the factory handlebar and I rotated 10 degrees and I measured from the gas tank to the line behind the bars, it was 2 inches. When I did the same with the 1.5 inch riser, it was 2 3/4 inches. So I had a 3/4 inch gain in rises. Now you have to ask yourself, if I put a 1.5 inch riser on the handlebars and they're both rotated at 10 degrees, what happened to the other 3/4 inch? That's the problem. And this is why it's an issue if you're a tall rider. When I compare the factory handlebar with the 10-degree rotation to the 1.5 inch riser or the riser block, what happens is I do end up with a extra 3/4 inch up, but that other 3/4 inch comes towards me. So 50% of that riser closes that cockpit and makes it worse. If you're a tall rider, the objective is to make the bike longer. If you could do it right, you would actually hack the bike in half and stretch it out and weld it back together. But that's not going to happen. So if you're 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", we know that motorcycle is never going to be right for you. It's never going to be perfect. So we're doing the best we can. Risers make it worse. If you're taller, you also have longer arms. So technique is part of it, and then we have to set the bike up properly. So the riser does give you a little bit of extra rise, but not as much as you might think. The other comparisons that I did, besides just adding the block riser, is I thought, well, what about that rotational riser? What about the rock riser where you can rock it back and forth? It's a 1.5 inch riser as well. I want to keep everything being relatively consistent. So that riser sits down here. What I did with the rocks riser is the goal is to fix this for the tall guys. How do we create extra space? If you rotate that rocks riser forward, then it's going to get your steering, it's going to be all funky. So what I did is I plumbed it, meaning that when you put the rocks riser into the mount, you rotate it until it's straight up and down. So it's plumb, straight down. So you end up basically just taking the handlebars and raising them up just a little bit. And that's what I wanted to do, is what would that do? Because that way we're not closing up the cockpit, we're only getting a rise. So that 1.5 inch rise, if I did the exact same plumb, there's a 0 gain or loss as far as cockpit space. So when I measured up here, it was 11.5 inches with a 0 degree rotation. I made sure it was 11.5 inches here with a 0 degree rotation. The difference is I ended up with 3.5 inches of rise. 3.5 inches. So you put a 1.5 inch riser on it, but because of the way everything works out, you end up with more rise than the actual riser. And that's because it's 1.5 inches of height, but when it rotates forward, because the factory handlebars are pointed back towards you, it's actually pivoting and rising up more than just the aluminum itself. If you do the 10-degree rotation that is so optimal for most of us, we end up with only a 3-degree raise on that motorcycle. So you go from, instead of 3.5 inch, you actually end up with a 3-inch gain over what you had on before. So the idea is that if I'm really extreme, if I'm a really tall guy, 6'5" or up in that range, those rocks risers may actually be the better choice because it's not going to close your cockpit as much, but it will definitely give you that extra height. So when you're standing up, it may be more comfortable. Most importantly, you don't want to do anything to that motorcycle that's going to close the cockpit. The best thing to do is to change the handlebars. Now, I did play around with this a little bit. When I put the KTM handlebars on the block risers, so let's take a look at that. Those are the numbers I have buried down here. Now on those, if I take the KTM and I do a 1.5 inch riser block, and then I rotate it forward 10 degrees. That's kind of what is the optimal here. That ends up giving me actually a 3.5 inch gain forward and a 1.5 inch gain up. So by having that smaller bar where the bar itself has less rise, even though it looks like a smaller handlebar, it actually provided me greater gains in all directions, forward and up. So if you're tall, think about what you're doing. It's just, if you add block risers, you're going to make it worse. You need to look at the entire package and how everything interacts. Here's the surprise. This is Christina's motorcycle. Turns out I don't use risers, but Christina, after tonight, does. On her 1200 GS, what I ended up doing was putting the block risers on after I did all my experimentation. She complains about just having too much reach in the handlebars. It's just too far away. And she wanted to have her cockpit be just a little bit smaller. The 1.5 inch risers on this, with a negative 10-degree rotation on the handlebars, brought the handlebars closer to her by 1/2 inch and dropped the handlebars by 1/2 inch. So now it's closer and lower for her for riding. I never considered putting risers on a motorcycle to lower the handlebars, but it turns out the numbers don't lie. On my commuter GS, I just kept the OEM bars and rotated 10 degrees. They gave me an 1.5 inch gain for rise and a 1/2 inch farther forward for more cockpit space. My GS Rally is certainly an extreme example of motorcycle setup. This has a set of flex bars on it. That isolates me from engine vibration, road vibration, and reduces fatigue when I'm riding off-road. The bars are narrower, making it easier for me to navigate in trails and off-road. It has a 15-degree sweep instead of 19, making the bars flatter and more comfortable when I'm in an upright standing position. And I have a set of rocks risers on it that rotate the bars towards me. The final setup on this motorcycle is 1.5 inch more rise than what's on the black BMW and 1 inch farther forward, which gives me more cockpit space. This bike's set up for extreme riding. It's ideal for that, but it doesn't make it ideal for you. The first thing you have to do is dial in your skill set. If your technique isn't right, you're not going to make adjustments that are correct, and you're going to you may end up undoing those changes later on down the road. So get your technique in play, set up the bike the way it was supposed to be set up from the factory, make those rider adjustments, then start making adjustments based on what you need then. Thanks for watching the channel. Thanks for subscribing. Make sure you leave some comments down below. If you haven't joined me on Patreon to help keep the channel alive, please consider joining me on Patreon. That's how this channel stays alive. If you like this content, leave some comments below. Let me know what you'd like to see. Until next time, Make sure you smile while you ride, and remember, attitude matters.